believe in this great country. I'll be happy to take questions as long as I see green. David Ray.
Congressman, first of all, thank you for addressing a lot of the stuff that comes up in the silly season as we get close to election. But I want to ask you a little bit more on the inflation topic, because you have a background in economics. And we need more people in Congress. I wish we had more people in Congress that had an idea about economics. The president is just gaslighting the whole country, telling us that this is Putin's, this is all because of Putin. Obviously, until we take back the House, everything that comes up for a vote is determined by Pelosi. But when we do take back the House in November, that will change. What sorts of policies would you want the House to pursue, specifically related to inflation? What kinds of things ought we be pursuing?
Thank you, David. Three things. First, why do we have inflation? Milton Friedman taught us that inflation is always, at all times, a monetary event. It means if you print too much money, if you have too much money chasing too few goods, you get inflation. I referenced a few minutes ago about Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, Vietnam, Richard Nixon. That period, between 1965 and 1975, the federal government was printing money. They were spending money hand over fist from Johnson's Great Society programs. Richard Nixon was a big government Republican. And government was growing. And at the same time, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy was low. They were buying government bonds and they were keeping interest rates too low. And what happened? We had the Persian Gulf first oil embargo of the early 70s. And when you combine those, too much money, and then you have a supply shock of a major commodity, and oil was even more important to our economy in 1972-3 than it is even today in some ways. And it was more concentrated, the amounts of it in the OPEC. You had this explosion of inflation. Coming out of the pandemic, let me remind you, this country spends $4.5 trillion a year on Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and all the spending programs, national parks, C-130s, whatever is your favorite. In the pandemic, this government spent $6 trillion on top of that $4.5 trillion. March, April, May of 2020. People had no idea what was going to happen. Dr. Fauci told us it was going to be horrendous. People were scared out of their minds. Businesses were shut down. The airlines had no passengers. So that's how much money was spent. In the fall, we should have stopped spending that money, and we should have stopped having the Federal Reserve buy that debt. They're buying that debt. They bought $2 trillion of government bonds and kept interest rates at zero. That's why we're repeating that horrendous amount of money chasing too few goods. And then what else did we have in the pandemic? We had a supply shock because people weren't making things in China or in West Texas. We stopped pumping oil and gas. People went home. So you had supply short and too much money, and we've got this inflation. Joe Biden gets elected. Has 3 spending proposals. He spends $2 trillion borrowed in March. No Republicans support it. He had this infrastructure bill, which is not an infrastructure bill. It's a Green New Deal bill. It's $2 trillion. It's all borrowed money. He passed that. Then he said he wanted to pass another $5 trillion. So again, in 2021, we put that much money on the table there. So here's what Republicans want to do, and I'll sit down.
Still talking about this.
Okay. Number one, go back to pre-pandemic spending policies for the federal government. Have the debate. What are we spending on defense? What are we spending on education? Go back to trying to balance that budget. Go back to debating on how small a deficit you could have, not how big a one you could have. Number two, stop politicizing the Federal Reserve. Urge the Fed to do what they need to do to contain inflation. That didn't happen until President Reagan was elected. And Paul Volcker was the Fed chair, and he stopped inflation. Do what you need to do to stop inflation. And third, and most important, Don't stop people from going back to work. Encourage people to go back to work. Don't block American energy. Unleash American energy. Get back to 13 million barrels a day. Lower prices here. Help our allies abroad. Don't buy oil from Iran and Venezuela. Buy it from Midland.